U.S. is producing more oil than ever. In fact, the U.S. is pumping more oil than any country ever has in the history of the world.
We will drill, baby, drill.
Today, we're diving deep into the paradox of American oil, how the United States became the world's top oil producer, why we still depend on foreign oil, and what this means for our future. We'll break down the facts, expose the controversies, and explore the hidden forces shaping America's energy story. Let's get started. The United States is producing more oil than ever before. In fact, the US is pumping more oil than any country ever has in the history of the world. Yet, the US is sending away nearly a third of its oil just to get it swapped out with oil from somewhere else. This is the story of America's wild oil revolution and why it still won't give the US true energy independence. This is a chart of the biggest oil producers in the world. To the surprise of many, the United States is right at the top. Last year alone, the US produced about 21 million barrels of oil every single day. That's almost double what Russia or Saudi Arabia produce individually, and even slightly more than what the US consumes each day. Yet, for decades, we've been led to believe that the US depends on foreign oil. Strangely enough, that's still partly true. Even now, after China, the US remains the second largest importer of crude oil globally, buying from about 15 different countries, including Canada, Mexico, Ghana, and Saudi Arabia. These imports, especially those from Saudi Arabia, may now be at risk because Iran is considering closing the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for US airstrikes. Some might say the US only imports 7% of its oil from Saudi Arabia, so we shouldn't worry about the Strait of Hormuz. But here's the surprise: the US also exports a huge chunk of its own oil, roughly 4 million barrels every day, and then turns around to buy 6.5 million barrels daily from other countries. So even if a smaller number of tankers are taken off the market in the Strait of Hormuz, the oil price will go up all over the world. That may be good news for US producers, but it's definitely not good news for consumers. So the question arises, why would the US export oil it already has, only to import more from somewhere else? To fully understand it, we first need to explore the paradox of the American oil ecosystem. America's daily oil output is higher than that of major oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Russia. But the US only ranks 11th when it comes to the actual size of oil reserves. According to recent data, the US holds roughly 36.5 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That sounds like a lot, but for comparison, Venezuela has around 300 billion barrels of oil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran also possess oil reserves significantly larger than the US. How does the US manage to produce so much oil despite its relatively modest reserves? It comes down to America's unique approach to oil production and strategic policies on how and when to tap into its resources. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar aren't interested in pumping out as much oil as possible every single day. Instead, they carefully control their production to avoid flooding the market, which would crash global oil prices. Their economies rely heavily on selling oil, so keeping prices stable and high matters a lot. Saudi Arabia's GDP is closely connected to global oil prices. Whenever oil prices rise, their economy thrives. When prices fall, their economy suffers. Countries like Saudi Arabia heavily depend on oil revenue, but they can't fully control global oil prices because the oil market is enormous and driven by countless buyers and sellers. For example, if a country like Iran suddenly pumps extra oil into the market to fund a war or solve an economic crisis, the increased supply pushes prices down sharply. That price drop then directly hurts other oil-dependent countries like Saudi Arabia, even though they had nothing to do with the extra supply. That's why, back in the 1990s, Saudi Arabia introduced a strategy to carefully manage their daily oil production, stabilizing prices and protecting their economy. Oil-exporting countries like Saudi Arabia must be very careful in controlling their daily output to maintain stable prices. The US, on the other hand, doesn't care as much about keeping oil prices high. In fact, the US prefers to keep them as low as possible. That's because we are dependent on oil, too. but in the opposite sense of Saudi Arabia. We love using oil, and that means we are a buyer, so we want the prices to be low. That's why America aggressively taps into its oil reserves, producing as much as it possibly can. The more oil available in the market, the lower the price. This approach, combined with major technological advancements in oil extraction, has allowed the U.S. to become the world's largest oil producer, despite having significantly smaller reserves than many other oil-rich nations. Back in the early 1900s, both the US and the world didn't really depend much on oil because energy sources like coal still dominated everyday life. Oil was abundant, but there wasn't much urgency to use it. Then, as World War I approached, things began to change quickly. Oil had unique benefits that coal couldn't match. Unlike coal, oil was easy to transport, simple to store, and could power not just ships and factories, but vehicles and airplanes. Petroleum was becoming a new kind of strategic weapon, a critical military resource. The U.S. Navy realized their ships would be faster, more efficient, and strategically more powerful if they were powered by oil rather than coal. To secure this advantage, the Navy made sure it had steady access to foreign oil, especially from Mexico or the Caribbean countries, which had large reserves and were close enough to supply America efficiently. But once World War I started, German submarines began attacking and sinking ships carrying oil across the Atlantic. Suddenly, America's dependence on foreign oil became a huge vulnerability and pushed the U.S. government into emergency action for greater domestic oil production. The government poured massive amounts of money, manpower, and scientific research into discovering and extracting oil at home. This led to the establishment of the U.S. Bureau of Mines in 1910, an agency dedicated to finding new ways to extract oil, refine it efficiently, and transport it safely over long distances, especially during wartime. Thanks to these developments, states like Texas, Oklahoma, and California soon became massive centers of oil production, rapidly transforming the U.S. into the world's most dominant petroleum producer. In 1914, America was responsible for 70% of the world's oil production. During the First World War alone, U.S. oil output increased by about 50%, surging beyond 500 million barrels a year by the end of the war. This expansion helped power not only American military efforts but also supported America's allies. Around the same time, major European powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands also realized oil was becoming the energy source of the future. These countries began establishing major international oil companies to secure and develop oil reserves globally. Meanwhile, the United States was working on something that would dramatically increase the nation's demand for oil. On July 7, 1919, a U.S. military convoy set out from Washington, D.C., heading across the country to San Francisco. Among the personnel was a young Army officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become president. Their mission was to inspect America's road system and transportation infrastructure by driving across the nation. What they saw was unexpected and disturbing. The roads were mostly dirt, filled with potholes and uneven terrain, and turned muddy after rain. Conditions were so poor that at times the convoy managed an average speed of just 5 miles per hour. This experience had a profound impact on Eisenhower. He quickly understood that good roads weren't just about convenience. They were a crucial national security issue. Decades later, when Eisenhower became president in the 1950s, he remembered the trip and took action. In 1956, he signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which created the Interstate Highway System, a modern nationwide network of high-quality roads connecting major cities, towns, and military installations across America. This decision transformed American life. Highways enabled efficient movement of goods, boosted commerce, and encouraged millions more Americans to buy and regularly drive automobiles. Even during those prosperous years, some policymakers in Washington anticipated a problem. They worried America's own oil fields might eventually fall short of rapidly growing demand. Luckily, foreign oil, especially from the Middle East, started looking like an attractive alternative because it was abundant and cheaper. The Middle East had just found itself sitting on massive oil reserves. Saudi Arabia quickly ramped up production and became a major player in the global oil market. Not only did the region have enormous reserves, but it could also extract and refine oil at significantly lower costs. Smart investments and an ideal geographic location further boosted Saudi Arabia's competitive advantage. But simply having cheap, plentiful oil wasn't enough. They also needed a big market. Global industrialization, especially in the US, provided exactly that. Demand for oil soared as factories multiplied and millions of cars hit American roads. Middle Eastern countries were perfectly placed to meet this increasing global thirst for oil. U.S. policymakers debated whether importing more oil might conserve America's own reserves for the future, but ultimately they rejected the idea of heavy reliance on foreign crude. In 1957, government committee warned that increasing imports would discourage domestic drilling, weakening national security. If foreign supply was ever disrupted, the U.S. would be vulnerable, a prediction that would come true in the 1970s. At the time, President Eisenhower imposed import quotas in 1959, strictly limiting foreign oil to protect domestic producers. The goal was to ensure the U.S. always had a healthy oil industry and ample capacity in case of emergencies. America largely remained self-sufficient into the early 1960s. But by the late 1960s, U.S. oil fields, especially in Texas, began reaching their peak. In 1970, domestic oil production hit an all-time high of about 9.6 million barrels per day. After this, production started to decline, but demand kept rising. Cars consumed more gasoline, and the economy kept growing. Soon, importing oil became necessary just to keep everything running. Facing fuel shortages, President Nixon lifted Eisenhower's import quotas in 1973, just as U.S. oil imports reached roughly 30% of total consumption. From that point on, the U.S. became heavily dependent on oil from overseas, a situation that made many policymakers uncomfortable. It quickly became clear how risky America's reliance on foreign oil could be. In October 1973, war broke out in the Middle East. When the United States gave military aid to Israel, Arab oil exporters retaliated by placing an embargo on oil shipments to America, abruptly choking off supplies. Practically overnight, the flow of Middle Eastern crude into U.S. ports dropped drastically. This triggered widespread panic. Global oil prices soared, first doubling and then quadrupling within just a few months. Across America, drivers faced endless lines at gas stations and empty fuel pumps. Gasoline was suddenly scarce and had to be rationed. Drastic steps had to be taken. One major move was the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975. Under this program, hundreds of millions of barrels of oil would be stored in massive underground salt caverns. This strategic stockpile provided America with an emergency supply of oil, ready to be released whenever necessary. Today, it's the largest publicly known emergency oil supply in the world, stored in Louisiana and Texas, capable of holding up to 714 million barrels. Since the Israel-Iran conflict started, crude oil prices have jumped 10%. With the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, crude oil prices are likely to jump even higher. Alongside creating strategic oil reserves, the U.S. government also tried to lower overall oil demand. For instance, it introduced a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour on highways to conserve fuel. The government also set federal fuel economy standards for the first time, requiring new vehicles to use gasoline more efficiently. Additionally, in 1974, America teamed up with other oil-importing countries to form the International Energy Agency, aiming for better cooperation in managing global oil supplies and crises. Just 1 month after Arab oil exports stopped, the U.S. government approved construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. Finished in 1977, this pipeline significantly increased domestic oil production by transporting crude from Alaska's North Slope to ports in the south. At the same time, the government encouraged further oil exploration and drilling efforts, both offshore and onshore. Despite these measures, America's dependence on foreign oil continued to grow throughout the 1970s. Soon enough, another crisis hit. In 1979, revolution erupted in Iran, which was a major global oil producer at the time. The Iranian government collapsed, and millions of barrels of oil were taken off the global markets. Almost overnight, Iran's exports plunged, triggering panic and a doubling of oil prices within just a few months. The impact hit the U.S. hard. Just like the 1973 gas crisis, gas stations struggled to keep enough fuel on hand, leading to endless lines and rationing. Experiencing two shocks within a single decade clearly revealed the country's vulnerability. As long as the U.S. relied heavily on foreign oil, events happening far away, whether revolutions, wars, or political turmoil, could instantly disrupt daily life at home, spike gas prices, and unsettle the entire economy. After these repeated shocks, the U.S. realized it had to cut its dependence on foreign oil or risk economic turmoil whenever conflicts erupted abroad. Completely cutting dependence on foreign oil was unrealistic. It would take decades. The only practical alternative was to manage and contain conflicts abroad. That's it from my side on this topic. If you found this video interesting or insightful, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update about the forces shaping our world. Also, do let me know about your views by commenting below. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and see you in the next one.